The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs as Xavier Vance's bullet found its target, a rattlesnake coiled dangerously close to his younger son's boot. The crowd that had gathered outside the general store fell silent, watching as the notorious rancher holstered his Colt with practiced precision, his face an emotionless mask beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Not a flicker of relief, not a hint of concern, just the same stone-cold expression the townspeople had grown accustomed to since his arrival 3 years prior. "Let's go," Xavier commanded, his deep voice carrying no room for argument as he placed a firm hand on each of his son's shoulders. 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Thomas followed obediently, their small boots kicking up dirt as they trailed their father back to their wagon. It was 1878 in the Arizona Territory, and Xavier Vance was as much a mystery as he was a legend. The whispers followed him everywhere: former gunslinger, widower, the man who'd never once been seen smiling in town. Some said grief had frozen his face permanently after his wife died in childbirth with Thomas. Others claimed he'd made a devil's bargain that stole his ability to feel joy. Whatever the truth, the townspeople of Redemption Springs gave him a wide berth, addressing him only when necessary for business. "Pa, can we get candy?" Thomas asked, his small voice almost a whisper as they passed the general store. "We've got what we need," Xavier replied curtly, loading the last of their supplies into the wagon. His weathered hands moved with efficiency, his mind already back at the ranch where endless work awaited. The boys exchanged disappointed glances but knew better than to press the issue. As Xavier climbed onto the driver's seat, he noticed a commotion down the street. A stagecoach had arrived, its dust-covered exterior suggesting a long journey. He paid it little mind. Newcomers to Redemption Springs rarely had anything to do with him and his boys. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, heading back to the isolated ranch that had become their fortress against the world. The 10-mile journey passed in familiar silence. Samuel occasionally pointed out a hawk circling overhead or a jackrabbit darting across their path, but Xavier acknowledged these observations with nothing more than a grunt. When the weathered fence line of the Vance ranch came into view, the boys visibly relaxed. Here, away from town and prying eyes, their father softened marginally. He might ruffle their hair or help Thomas fashion a wooden toy. But even these moments of tenderness were fleeting, overwhelmed by the shadow of loss that seemed to follow Xavier like a faithful dog. "Get the chickens fed before sunset," Xavier instructed as he unloaded the wagon. "I'll start on dinner once I've tended to the horses." The boys nodded and scurried off to their chores, their small forms silhouetted against the setting sun. Xavier watched them for a moment, a familiar ache settling in his chest. They deserved better than a father who couldn't even smile for them, who couldn't provide the warmth and guidance their mother would have given so freely. The next morning brought unexpected news via their nearest neighbor, old Jim Patterson, who rode up just as Xavier was heading out to check the south pasture. "Town's got a new schoolteacher," Jim announced, tipping his hat in greeting. "Stage brought her in yesterday. Pretty young thing named Catherine Bailey. Sheriff says she's from Boston, of all places." Xavier nodded, acknowledging the information while showing no particular interest. "Townfolk been waiting on a teacher since Mrs. Henderson left last winter." "Thought you might want to know on account of your boys," Jim continued, shifting in his saddle. "She's opening the school next Monday. Most families are sending their young'uns." Xavier's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The boy's education had been on his mind. Samuel could barely read, despite Xavier's attempts at teaching him from his wife's old Bible, and Thomas hadn't even started. But the thought of sending them into town daily, away from the ranch's security, made his stomach knot. "I'll think on it," he said finally, which was more consideration than he usually gave to town matters. Jim seemed satisfied with this response and moved on to discussions about water rights and cattle prices before riding off. Xavier stood for a long moment, watching dust rise from Jim's horse's hooves, his mind turning over this new development. That evening, as they ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Xavier studied his sons. Their faces were tanned from the Arizona sun, their hands already showing the calluses of ranch work. But they were still boys young, curious, with futures stretching before them that should contain more than just hard labor and isolation. "There's a new schoolteacher in town," he said abruptly, causing both boys to look up in surprise at this unexpected conversation opener. "She's starting classes Monday." Samuel's eyes widened. "Are we going to school, Pa?" Xavier took a slow breath. "Your ma would have wanted you to have proper learning." The mention of their mother, something rare in their household, hung in the air like a physical presence. Thomas, who had no memories of the woman who died giving him life, squirmed in his seat. "Will we learn to read big books?" Thomas asked, excitement creeping into his voice. "I expect so," Xavier replied, already second-guessing his decision. The boys chattered excitedly throughout the meal, peppered with questions Xavier couldn't answer. What would the teacher be like? Would there be other children their age? Would they have to sit still all day? By Monday morning, Xavier had almost changed his mind a dozen times. But as he loaded the boys into the wagon, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair slicked down with water, he knew he was doing what Elizabeth would have wanted. The thought of his late wife provided little comfort as they made the journey into town, a journey that seemed shorter than usual with the boys' animated conversation filling the air. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a modest white building with a small bell tower. Several children and parents were already gathered outside when Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop. He hesitated, uncomfortable with the social niceties of delivering his sons to school, but steeled himself to see it through. "Wait here," he instructed the boys, helping them down from the wagon. It was then that Catherine Bailey emerged from the schoolhouse, and Xavier felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a momentary falter in his carefully constructed composure. She stood perhaps 5'4", with auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun, though several tendrils had escaped to frame a heart-shaped face. Her dress was sensible but well-made, a deep blue that matched her eyes. Those eyes now landed on Xavier and his sons, accompanied by a warm smile that transformed her entire countenance. "Good morning," she called, walking toward them with confident steps. "You must be new students." Xavier cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how intimidating he might appear in his worn duster and unshaven face. "Samuel and Thomas Vance," he said gruffly. "They haven't had much schooling." Catherine Bailey's smile didn't falter as she bent slightly to address the boys. "Samuel and Thomas, I'm very pleased to meet you. I'm Miss Bailey." She extended her hand first to Samuel, who shook it shyly, then to Thomas, who beamed up at her. "I can write my name," Samuel offered, clearly wanting to make a good impression. "That's wonderful," Catherine replied, genuine enthusiasm in her voice. "We'll build on that skill right away." She straightened and turned her attention back to Xavier. "And you must be Mr. Vance. I've heard about your ranch northeast of town." Xavier nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with the idea that people talked about him. "What time should I collect them?" If Catherine was put off by his brusqueness, she didn't show it. "School dismisses at 3 o'clock. The children bring their own lunches." She paused, studying him with a directness that few people dared. "Mr. Vance, I want to assure you that your boys will be in good hands. Education is a sacred trust." Something in her earnestness caught Xavier off guard. "I'm sure they will," he managed, then turned to his sons. "Mind Miss Bailey and behave yourselves. I'll be back at 3. With that, he returned to his wagon, feeling oddly unsettled as he drove away. He glanced back once to see Miss Bailey leading his sons into the schoolhouse, her hand resting gently on Thomas's shoulder. The image stayed with him throughout the day as he mended fences and checked on a pregnant heifer, his sons walking beside a woman who wasn't their mother but who might, perhaps, offer something he couldn't. The next 2 weeks established a new routine. Xavier would drive the boys to school each morning, exchange the briefest of pleasantries with Miss Bailey, then spend the day working alone on the ranch before returning to collect them. Each evening, dinner conversation now centered around school activities, spelling bees and arithmetic competitions, a science experiment with magnets, the history of the Arizona Territory. "Miss Bailey says I'm a natural reader," Samuel announced one evening, pride evident in his voice. She gave me a special book about explorers to practice with. And I drew a picture of our ranch, Thomas added excitedly. Miss Bailey hung it on the wall with the other drawings. Xavier listened, noting the frequent mentions of Miss Bailey says and Miss Bailey showed us. The teacher had clearly made an impression on his sons. What surprised him was how he found himself looking forward to those brief morning interactions the way she always greeted him by name, her unfailing politeness despite his terseness, the gentle firmness with which she managed the students. It was the following Sunday when everything changed. Xavier was repairing a bridle on the front porch when he heard Samuel's hesitant footsteps. "Pa," the boy began cautiously, "Thomas and I were wondering about something." Xavier set aside the bridle. "What is it?" "Miss Bailey invited all the students to church today. She said it's important for learning about morality." "Morality," Xavier corrected automatically. "Yes, that, and Thomas really wants to go because Miss Bailey said there'd be singing and—" Samuel trailed off, clearly uncertain about his father's reaction. Church. The word itself brought back memories. Xavier had spent years suppressing Elizabeth in her Sunday best, her hair catching the sunlight as they walked together into the small church in Kansas where they'd met. The pastor who'd married them. The same pastor who'd buried her 3 years later, while Xavier stood holding an infant Thomas and young Samuel, rage and grief warring within him as the preacher spoke of God's mysterious ways. "Please, Pa," Thomas appeared beside his brother, his small face hopeful. "Miss Bailey says there are stories about heroes and adventures." Xavier looked at his sons' eager faces and felt the familiar weight of inadequacy. He hadn't set foot in a church since Elizabeth's funeral, hadn't spoken to God except in occasional curses. But his boys were asking for something simple: community stories, perhaps even the comfort of faith that he himself had abandoned. "You can go," he said finally, the decision surprising even him. "I'll hitch up the wagon." The boys' faces lit up with such joy that Xavier felt a pang of regret for all the times he'd denied them similar simple pleasures. As they scrambled to change into their cleanest clothes, Xavier remained on the porch, contemplating the day ahead. He had no intention of entering the church himself. He would drop the boys off, and perhaps use the time to purchase supplies at the general store, which opened briefly after services for those who came from outlying areas. But when they arrived at the white clapboard church on the opposite end of town from the schoolhouse, Xavier's plans immediately encountered a complication. Catherine Bailey stood greeting families at the church steps, radiant in a pale yellow dress that made her appear to glow in the morning sunlight. When she spotted Samuel and Thomas in the wagon, her face registered pleasant surprise, followed by a warm smile that encompassed Xavier as well. "Mr. Vance, Samuel, Thomas, good morning," she called, walking toward them. "I'm so pleased you decided to join us today." The boys jumped down from the wagon before Xavier could stop them, rushing to meet their teacher with unrestrained enthusiasm. Xavier remained seated, his hands tight on the reins. "The boys wanted to come," he explained, his voice rougher than intended. "I'll return after services." Catherine's expression shifted subtly, not disappointment exactly, but something that made Xavier feel as though he'd failed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "Of course," she said evenly. Then, with a directness that seemed characteristic of her, she added, "Though you'd be most welcome to stay, Mr. Vance. Pastor Miller gives a thoughtful sermon and the congregation is quite friendly." Before Xavier could formulate a polite refusal, Thomas tugged at Catherine's sleeve. "Pa doesn't go to church," he explained with the innocent bluntness of childhood. "He doesn't smile in town neither." Xavier felt heat rise to his face as Catherine's eyes returned to him, curiosity evident in their blue depths. "Is that so?" she asked softly, not to Thomas but to Xavier himself. Something in her gaze, not pity but a genuine interest, made Xavier uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of his worn clothing and the 3-day stubble on his jaw. "I'll return at noon," he said gruffly, preparing to snap the reins. "The service ends at 11:30, Catherine informed him. "Perhaps you might reconsider and join us, for the boys' sake," she added, her tone gentle but somehow challenging. Xavier looked past her to where Samuel and Thomas were already being greeted by other children, their faces alight with the simple joy of belonging. Something twisted in his chest, the realization that his own isolation had become theirs by default. "I'll think on it," he said finally, the same noncommittal phrase he'd given Jim Patterson about the school. Catherine smiled as if he'd already agreed. "We saved the back pew for latecomers," she said, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been understanding. "No one would mind if you slipped in after the service begins." With that, she turned to greet another family, leaving Xavier with the distinct impression he'd just been outmaneuvered by the schoolteacher. He drove the wagon to the livery stable, his mind wrestling with conflicting impulses. The general store wouldn't open for another hour, leaving him with little to occupy his time except his own thoughts, a dangerous proposition at the best of times. Almost against his will, Xavier found himself walking toward the church as the bell began to toll, calling the faithful to worship. He paused outside, listening to the congregation singing a hymn he vaguely remembered from his youth. The sound carried him back to Sunday mornings with his parents, to the simple faith he'd once accepted without question. He hadn't planned to enter. Hadn't planned to ease open the door and slip into the last pew, just as Pastor Miller began reading from the book of Matthew. But when Xavier spotted his sons sitting 3 rows ahead beside Catherine Bailey, their small heads bowed respectfully as they attempted to follow along in a shared hymnal, something inside him shifted. The sermon passed in a blur. Xavier caught phrases about forgiveness and new beginnings, about the burden of carrying grief alone when it was meant to be shared. Words that seemed aimed directly at him, though the pastor couldn't possibly know his story. When the final hymn was sung and the congregation began to disperse, Xavier remained seated, uncertain of what had compelled him to stay and what he should do now. It was Samuel who spotted him first, his small face registering shock before breaking into a smile of such pure joy that Xavier felt it like a physical blow. The boy tugged on his brother's sleeve and then on Catherine's hand, pointing toward the back of the church where their father sat. Xavier stood as they approached, feeling awkward and exposed under the curious glances of the departing congregation. "Pa, you came inside," Thomas exclaimed, reaching for Xavier's hand with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. "For a little while," Xavier acknowledged, his eyes moving from his sons to Catherine, who was watching the exchange with evident pleasure. "I'm glad you reconsidered, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "The boys were wonderful participants." Xavier nodded, unsure how to navigate this unexpected social situation. He was saved from having to respond when Pastor Miller approached, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Welcome to our congregation, Mr. Vance." "I don't believe we've formally met, though I've seen you in town. I'm Pastor Daniel Miller." "Xavier Vance," he replied, accepting the handshake. "Just came to hear the boys sing." The pastor smiled knowingly. Many a parent has returned to church through their children. God works in mysterious ways. Xavier might have bristled at the presumption in the past, but today he found himself simply nodding. The boys seemed to enjoy it. "We're having a community picnic after services," Pastor Miller continued, "right behind the church in the meadow. You and your sons would be most welcome." Before Xavier could formulate a polite refusal, Catherine interjected, "The children have been practicing a song to perform, Mr. Vance. Thomas has a small solo part." Thomas looked up at his father with such hopeful anticipation that Xavier found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered the implications. "We can stay a while." The meadow behind the church had been transformed with tables covered in checkered cloths, laden with dishes brought by congregation members. Children played tag around the periphery while adults gathered in conversational groups, the atmosphere relaxed and welcoming. Xavier felt conspicuously out of place, a solitary shadow among the colorful Sunday attire, but for his son's sake, he remained. Catherine seemed to sense his discomfort, appearing at his side with a plate of food and a gentle suggestion. "Mrs. Peterson always brings the best fried chicken. You should try it before it's gone." Xavier accepted the plate with murmured thanks, finding himself oddly comforted by her presence. She didn't press him for conversation, but stood beside him in companionable silence as they watched the children organize for their performance. "Your boys have adjusted remarkably well to school," Catherine observed finally. "Samuel has a quick mind for mathematics, and Thomas shows real artistic talent." Pride and emotion Xavier rarely allowed himself swelled in his chest. Their mother was good with numbers and drawing. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned Elizabeth to anyone in town, and the significance wasn't lost on Catherine. She turned slightly toward him, her expression thoughtful. "They speak of her sometimes, you know, especially Samuel. He has memories he treasures." Xavier's throat tightened. He was 5 when she passed. Thomas was just born. Catherine nodded, her eyes gentle. "Loss shapes us, Mr. Vance, but it need not define us entirely. Your sons are testament to that. They carry her in their hearts but still embrace life with joy." Something in her words penetrated the armor Xavier had spent years constructing. Before he could respond, the children's performance began, drawing their attention to the makeshift stage where Thomas stood, small but determined, to sing his brief solo. His high, clear voice carried across the meadow, singing of faith and hope, and Xavier felt an unexpected wetness in his eyes that he quickly blinked away. When the performance ended, both boys ran to their father, faces flushed with excitement. "Did you hear me, Pa? Did you hear my part?" Thomas asked breathlessly. "I heard you," Xavier confirmed, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did well, both of you." Samuel beamed at the praise, then tugged at his father's sleeve. "Miss Bailey taught us the song. She says music is good for the soul." Xavier's eyes found Catherine's over the boys' heads. "Miss Bailey seems to know a lot of things." "Not nearly enough," she replied with a self-deprecating smile. "But I do know that those boys adore their father, and they're tremendously proud when you show interest in their activities." The simple observation struck Xavier with unexpected force. He had always provided for his sons food, shelter, protection, but had he ever truly shown interest in their thoughts, their feelings, their small triumphs? Had he been present in the ways that mattered most? The afternoon progressed, and to Xavier's surprise, he found himself drawn into conversations with other ranchers and townspeople. Not deep exchanges, but civil discussions about cattle prices and weather predictions, normal interactions that had once been part of his life before grief isolated him. Through it all, he was aware of Catherine Bailey moving among the gathering, her laughter carrying across the meadow, her kindness evident in every interaction. As the sun began to lower and families started packing up to head home, Xavier collected his sons, who were reluctant to leave the festivities. They bid goodbye to their school friends and headed toward the wagon, only to find Catherine walking the same direction. "My boarding house is on the way out of town," she explained. "I thought I might ask for a ride if it's not an imposition. These shoes aren't made for long walks." She gestured ruefully at her dress boots. Xavier nodded, helping her onto the wagon seat beside him while the boys scrambled into the back. As they drove through town, Catherine pointed out buildings of historical interest that she'd learned about since her arrival: the original trading post that was now the general store, the former cavalry outpost that had become the sheriff's office. "You've taken an interest in Redemption Springs," Xavier observed. "I believe in knowing the stories of a place," Catherine replied. "It helps to understand the people." She paused, then added more softly, "Some stories aren't written down anywhere, though. They have to be shared willingly." Xavier felt the weight of her implication, but couldn't bring himself to respond. They continued in silence until reaching Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, a well-maintained 2-story building with a wide front porch. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Vance," Catherine said as he helped her down from the wagon. She turned to the boys. "I'll see you both tomorrow at school. Remember your spelling words." "Yes, Miss Bailey," they chorused. As Xavier prepared to drive away, Catherine placed a hand lightly on his arm. "The church picnic happens every second Sunday, Mr. Vance. The boys would love to have you attend regularly, I'm sure." There was something in her eyes, an invitation that extended beyond church attendance, that made Xavier's heart beat a rhythm he'd thought long forgotten. "Maybe," he said, surprising himself with the admission of possibility. Catherine's smile in response was worth the discomfort of uncertainty. I look forward to seeing what maybe becomes. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the Vance household. Xavier found himself asking the boys about their school day rather than waiting for them to volunteer information. He listened to their spelling words each evening, helped Samuel with difficult mathematics problems, and admired Thomas's increasingly sophisticated drawings. And each morning, his brief interactions with Catherine Bailey at the schoolhouse grew less perfunctory. Sometimes he arrived early enough to help her carry teaching materials inside. Occasionally, he found himself lingering after dropping the boys off, discussing a book she'd mentioned or a lesson she was planning. He learned that she was 26, the daughter of a Boston physician who had encouraged her education but been perplexed by her desire to teach in the Western Territories. He wanted me to marry a banker or a lawyer, she confided one morning as they stood outside the schoolhouse. But I've always believed life should be more than societal expectations. Xavier found himself nodding in agreement. The West teaches you quick what matters and what doesn't. And what matters to you, Mr. Vance? She asked, her gaze direct in that way that never failed to unsettle him. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes moving to where his sons were playing with other children before school began. Them, he said finally, making sure they have what they need. And you, Catherine pressed gently, what do you need? The question hung between them, charged with implications Xavier wasn't ready to acknowledge. He was saved from responding by the school bell, which Catherine rang to summon the students inside. Another time, perhaps, she said with a smile that suggested she knew exactly how discomfiting her question had been. The second Sunday arrived, and Xavier found himself hitching up the wagon without the boys having to ask. They attended church and the subsequent picnic, and this time Xavier was less a reluctant participant than an expected community member. Several ranchers sought his opinion on a proposed irrigation project. Mrs. Peterson made sure he received a generous portion of her fried chicken. And Catherine Bailey, lovely in a pale green dress that made her eyes appear more vibrant than usual, seemed never far from his awareness. It was during the children's game of tag that Xavier found himself alone with her again, both of them watching from the shade of a large oak tree as Thomas raced across the meadow, shrieking with laughter as he evaded an older boy. He runs like his mother, Xavier said quietly, the observation slipping out unbidden. Catherine turned to him, surprise evident in her expression at this voluntary mention of his late wife. Tell me about her, she said softly, if you'd like to. And to his own astonishment, Xavier found that he did want to. Words that had been locked away for years came hesitantly at first, then with increasing fluidity as he described Elizabeth her quick laugh, her talent for coaxing flowers to grow in the harshest soil, her unwavering belief in his ability to build a future for their family. She was carrying Thomas when the fever hit, he said, his voice lowering. Doctors said he could save her or the baby, but probably not both. She wouldn't hear of risking Thomas. He paused, the familiar ache of loss rising within him. Her last words to me were to promise I'd let the boys know joy. That I wouldn't let grief steal their childhood. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A mother's final gift, she said finally, and a heavy burden for you to carry alone. I haven't kept that promise well, Xavier admitted, the confession wrenching from some deep place within him. I've provided, protected, but joy that's been in short supply at the Vance Ranch. Yet you brought them to school, Catherine pointed out, to church. You're finding your way back to that promise, Xavier. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her gentle voice struck him with unexpected force. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the pretty schoolteacher, but a woman of remarkable insight and compassion, who had somehow slipped past his defenses when he wasn't looking. Why did you really come to Redemption Springs? He asked suddenly. A Boston doctor's daughter could teach anywhere. Catherine's smile held a hint of sadness. Perhaps I was running too, in my way, from expectations from a life mapped out by others. She looked across the meadow where the children played, or perhaps I was searching for something authentic. Something true. Their eyes met, and Xavier felt a connection he'd believed forever lost to him, the recognition of another soul who understood both loss and hope. The moment was interrupted by Thomas running up to them, breathless and flushed with excitement. "Pa, Miss Bailey, come play with us." "We need more people for Red Rover," Catherine laughed, the sound like music in the afternoon air. "What do you say, Mr. Vance? Shall we join the game?" Xavier hesitated, aware of several townspeople watching with undisguised curiosity. The old Xavier would have declined, retreated behind his wall of stoic solitude. But something had shifted these past weeks, something fundamental in how he viewed his place in the world and his son's future within it. "Why not?" he said, and was rewarded with Thomas's whoop of delight and Catherine's radiant smile. Later, as they drove Catherine back to her boarding house, the boys drowsy in the back of the wagon after an afternoon of play, Xavier found himself reluctant for the day to end. "Would you?" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the invitation forming in his mind. Catherine waited patiently, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. "The boys and I, we have a Sunday tradition, after church. Fishing at the creek that runs through the north end of my property." It wasn't entirely true they'd done it exactly once, the previous Sunday, but Xavier pressed on. "They'd be pleased if you joined us next week." Catherine's expression softened into something that made Xavier's heart beat faster. "I'd be honored," she said. "Though I should warn you, I've never caught a fish in my life." "Samuel will show you," Xavier assured her. "He's got a knack for it." As he helped her down from the wagon at her boarding house, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. Catherine looked up at him, her blue eyes serious despite her smile. "You smiled today," she said quietly. "During the game, did you know?" Xavier hadn't realized, but now he recognized the unfamiliar sensation in his facial muscles, the lightness in his chest that had accompanied it. "Must have forgotten I wasn't supposed to," he replied, surprising himself with the touch of humor. Catherine's laughter was worth any amount of discomfort. "I like your smile, Xavier Vance," she said simply. "I hope to see more of it." As the wagon pulled away, Samuel sat up in the back, his young face thoughtful. "Pa, do you like Miss Bailey, not just as our teacher, but, you know?" Xavier considered deflecting the question but found himself unwilling to dismiss his son's perceptiveness. "Miss Bailey is a fine woman," he said carefully. "Smart, kind, good with you boys." Samuel nodded, satisfied with this response. "Ma would have liked her too, I think." The simple observation hit Xavier with unexpected force, the idea that Elizabeth would have approved of Catherine, would perhaps have even wanted him to find happiness again. It was a thought that would have been unbearable months ago, but now felt like a blessing, a permission he hadn't known he was seeking. The fishing expedition the following Sunday was the first of many shared outings. Catherine proved an eager, if initially clumsy, student, her delighted laughter when she finally caught a small trout bringing smiles to all three Vance males. She joined them for Sunday dinner afterward, her presence in the ranch house somehow transforming it from a functional dwelling back into a home. As spring turned to summer, Catherine became a regular visitor to the ranch. She helped the boys plant a vegetable garden, taught them songs around the campfire Xavier built on cool evenings, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, helped Xavier himself remember how to engage with life beyond mere survival. It was on a warm July evening, with the boys already asleep and the desert stars brilliant overhead, that Xavier finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building within him for months. They sat on the porch swing he'd built at Catherine's suggestion, the gentle creaking of the chains a rhythmic accompaniment to the night sounds of the ranch. Her hand rested lightly in his, a comfort he'd come to cherish. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Xavier said quietly, his eyes on the distant mountains rather than on her face. "After Elizabeth died, it seemed like part of me died with her, the part that knew how to be happy, how to look forward instead of back." Catherine's hand tightened on his. "Grief changes us," she acknowledged, "but it doesn't have to be the end of joy." Xavier turned to her then, taking in the features that had become so dear to him, the intelligence in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the strength evident in her posture despite her delicate appearance. "The boys adore you," he said. "They've flourished with you in their lives, and I—" He paused, searching for words adequate to express the transformation he'd undergone. "I've remembered what it means to live, not just exist." Catherine's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "Xavier, I love you," he said simply, the declaration both terrifying and liberating. "I don't have much to offer a hard-working ranch, two rambunctious boys, a man still learning how to smile again, but all of it is yours if you want it." Catherine's response was to lean forward and press her lips gently to their first kiss, sweet and promising and full of unspoken understanding. When she pulled back, her smile outshone the stars overhead. "I came to Redemption Springs looking for purpose," she whispered. "I never expected to find a family." They were married in the white clapboard church the following month, with Samuel and Thomas standing proudly beside them as Pastor Miller spoke of second chances and God's enduring grace. The entire town turned out for the celebration, perhaps as much to witness the phenomenon of Xavier Vance smiling openly as to share in the couple's happiness. And smile he did when Catherine appeared in her simple white dress, when Thomas spontaneously hugged his new stepmother during the ceremony, when Samuel solemnly presented them with the rings. It was as if the ability, once remembered, could no longer be suppressed. "I told you," Thomas was overheard whispering to a school friend during the reception. "Pa doesn't smile in town except when Miss Catherine is there." Later, as they danced under lantern light in the meadow behind the church, the same meadow where Xavier had first begun to open his heart again, Catherine looked up at her new husband with eyes full of love. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first invited the boys to church, I never imagined I was setting a much larger plan in motion." Xavier's arm tightened around her waist. "Maybe you were just the instrument," he suggested, his voice warm with affection. "Elizabeth always said God works in mysterious ways." Catherine's laughter joined with his, rising toward the starlit sky, a promise of joy reclaimed and a future filled with smiles both in town and at home, where a family once fractured by grief had found its way to wholeness again.